York City glittered after the evening rain, the lights of the Metropolitan Tower reflecting in the wet streets of Midtown. Alexander Sterling stood by the panoramic window of his apartment on the 30th floor of the modern Sterling Tower, observing the city stretching out before him. He was 42 years old, but the lines around his eyes and the premature silver at his temples added years to his appearance. As one of the wealthiest men in the country, owner of Sterling Capital, he had everything. Money, power, respect. Everything but peace of mind. From behind him, a quiet sob echoed. Alexander sighed deeply, turning to look towards the bedroom of his 5-year-old son, Nicholas. 2 years had passed since the death of his wife, Anne, who had lost her battle with breast cancer. 2 years during which Nicholas hadn't slept peacefully a single night. "Mr. Sterling, it's the same thing again," said Mrs. Eleanor, the 60-year-old housekeeper who had worked for the Sterling family for over a decade. Her face showed both exhaustion and helplessness. "The little one can't fall asleep. He's crying for his mom." Alexander ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Did you try reading him a story, turning on that star projector lamp we bought last week?" "Everything, Mr. Sterling. Everything as usual. Nothing helps." Alexander walked to his son's bedroom. Nicholas lay curled under a comforter adorned with astronauts, his brown eyes, so much like Anne's, filled with tears. A small plush teddy bear, his last gift from his mum, was clutched tightly to his chest. "Nicholas, son." Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, placing a hand on the boy's head. "You need to sleep. It's late." "I want my mommy," Nicholas whispered, his lower lip trembling. "Why doesn't mommy come back?" Those words tore at Alexander's heart every time. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that his mother would never return, that she was gone forever? "Mommy's a star in the sky now, remember? She's always watching over you." He repeated the words he spoke almost daily, though he himself wasn't sure if he believed them. The next morning, Alexander sat in his office in the Sterling Tower, reviewing documents for a new development project in Chicago. His secretary, Ms. Olivia, knocked on the door. "Mr. Sterling, Yvonne Miller from HR is here. She says it's urgent." Yvonne Miller, the 45-year-old HR director at his company, entered the office with several folders in her hand. "Alexander, I've reviewed all the resumes for Nicholas's nanny position, as you asked," she said, placing the documents on his desk. "I've narrowed it down to 5 top candidates. All of them have experience working with children in difficult emotional situations." Alexander glanced through the documents, but none of them impressed him. Over the past 2 years, he had hired and fired 7 nannies. None had been able to connect with Nicholas. None had been able to make the boy feel safe. "Anything else?" he asked, pushing the folders aside. Yvonne hesitated for a moment. "Well, there's one more resume that came in this morning. I didn't add it to the selected ones because the candidate is only 26 years old and doesn't have as impressive experience as the others." "Then why are you even mentioning her?" "Because she specializes in working with children who've experienced trauma. She studied child psychology at Columbia University and volunteered at a children's hospice. She also has references from families she's helped." Yvonne pulled out an additional folder. "Her name is Julia Matthews." Alexander reluctantly took the folder and opened it. A young woman with warm green eyes and light brown hair, tied in a casual bun, looked back at him from the photo. Her smile was genuine and engaging. He skimmed her resume, graduated with honors, experience that, though not extensive, seemed intense and meaningful. "Set up an interview for tomorrow," he decided suddenly, surprised by his own decision. "With which candidate?" Yvonne asked. "With Julia Matthews." The next day, Julia sat in the waiting area outside Alexander's office. She wore a simple navy blue dress and minimal makeup. Her hands, clasped in her lap, trembled slightly. It wasn't every day she met one of the wealthiest men in the country. When she was ushered into the office, Alexander was surprised by her short stature. She barely reached his shoulder. but the way she moved and spoke exuded confidence and calm. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for inviting me," she said, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "Please have a seat, Ms. Matthews. Why do you believe you're suited to care for my son?" he asked without preamble. Julia didn't seem surprised by the direct question. "I read about your son's situation in the information I received from HR. A boy who lost his mother and can't sleep, who is grieving in his own childlike way," she began calmly. "I won't pretend to have a magic cure for his problems, but I have experience working with children after a loss. I know how to listen, how to be present, and how to help them understand emotions that are too complicated for them." Alexander watched her carefully. "My son has had 7 nannies. None of them could help him. Maybe he doesn't need a nanny. Maybe he needs someone who will simply be there for him," Julia responded. "Someone who won't try to replace his mother, but will help him understand what happened and how to live on." Those words hit Alexander harder than he expected. He himself was still learning how to live without Anne. "When can you start?" he asked after a moment of silence. Julia raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Does that mean I have the job?" "Provided you can start immediately." "I can start tomorrow morning," she replied without hesitation. That evening, Alexander returned home earlier than usual. He found Nicholas in the living room, where the boy was playing with Lego bricks, building something that resembled a spaceship. Mrs. Eleanor was bustling in the kitchen, preparing dinner. "Dad!" Nicholas called out, but there was no joy in his voice, only a sense of obligation, as if he knew he should be excited to see his father. "Hey there, little engineer." Alexander crouched beside his son. "What are you building?" "A spaceship. It's going to fly to Mommy," Nicholas replied, not looking up from his bricks. Alexander felt a lump in his throat. "Tomorrow you'll meet a new person who will take care of you. Her name is Julia, and she's very kind." Nicholas shrugged. "She probably won't stay long anyway." That adult response from a 5-year-old was like a punch to the gut. Alexander realized how much he had neglected his son over the past 2 years, focusing on his own pain and work. At midnight, as every night, Alexander heard crying coming from Nicholas's room. He got out of bed, where he couldn't sleep anyway, and went to his son. The boy sat on the bed, holding a framed photo of Anne. "I can't sleep, Dad," Nicholas whispered. "I'm afraid if I fall asleep, I'll forget what Mommy looks like." Alexander sat next to his son and put an arm around him. "You'll never forget what Mommy looks like. She's right here." He touched Nicholas's heart. "And here," he touched his head. "She'll always be with us, even if we can't see her." "Promise?" Nicholas asked, looking at him with wide eyes. "I promise," Alexander replied, though he wasn't sure himself if it was true. Was Anne really somewhere? Or was he just deceiving himself and his child? Julia Matthews arrived the next day promptly at 8 o'clock in the morning. She wore jeans, a simple blouse, and comfortable shoes. Her hair was tied in a loose braid, and she carried a colorful backpack. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she greeted him when Alexander opened the door. "I'm ready to start." Alexander led her inside. The apartment was spacious and decorated in a minimalist style. Lots of glass, metal, and lightwood. Few personal touches, apart from photos of Nicholas and a few photographs of Anne that stood on a dresser in the living room. "Nicholas is in his room," Alexander said. "I warn you, he might be difficult." Julia smiled gently. Children going through difficult experiences often are. It's their way of coping with a situation they don't understand. He led her to Nicholas's room. The boy sat on the floor, drawing something intently. He didn't look up when they entered. "Nicholas, this is Julia, the one I told you about," Alexander said. "She'll be taking care of you." The boy cast a quick glance at Julia and returned to his drawing. "Hi," he mumbled without enthusiasm. "Hi, Nicholas," Julia replied, not trying to get closer to him. "What are you drawing?" "A rocket," the boy answered succinctly. "I have to go to work," Alexander said, feeling awkward. "Mrs. Eleanor is in the kitchen if you need anything." Julia nodded. "Please don't worry. We'll be fine." Alexander left, but before he closed the door, he heard Julia say to Nicholas, "You know, I once wanted to be an astronaut, but it turned out I was too short. Maybe you can tell me about space." All day, Alexander couldn't focus on work. Every hour he called Mrs. Eleanor, asking about Nicholas and the new nanny. The housekeeper assured him that everything was fine, that Julia had taken the boy for a walk in Central Park, and then they had read books together. When he returned home that evening, he found Julia and Nicholas in the kitchen. They were baking cookies together, and the kitchen looked like a small tornado had passed through it. Flour was everywhere, including on Nicholas's face, which made him look like a little ghost. "Dad!" Nicholas called out, and there was more energy in his voice than in months. "Julia and I are making cookies. She says baking is like little science experiments, like in a lab." Alexander looked at Julia, who shrugged with a smile. "We're not much of chemists, but the cookies should be edible," she said. For the first time in a long while, Nicholas ate dinner without protest and even chatted at the table, telling his father about their day at the park, the ducks they had fed, and the books they had read. When it was time for his bath and bedtime, Alexander expected the traditional resistance and crying, but Nicholas allowed Julia to lead him to the bathroom without protest. Afterward, Alexander sat in the living room reviewing documents, when Julia emerged from Nicholas's room and quietly closed the door behind her. "He's asleep," she said with disbelief in her voice. "He just fell asleep." Alexander stood up abruptly. "That's impossible. He never—" "See for yourself." Julia gestured towards the boy's door. Alexander cautiously opened the door and peeked inside. Nicholas was indeed asleep, breathing deeply and calmly, clutching his teddy bear. "How did you do it?" he asked, when they returned to the living room. Julia sat on the sofa. "I didn't do anything magical, if that's what you're asking. We just talked. About his mom, about how much he misses her, about how it's normal to be sad and angry when someone we love leaves, and about how his mom would surely want him to be happy and get enough sleep so he could grow big and strong." Alexander felt tears welling in his eyes. He turned away quickly, not wanting Julia to see. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you." "It's only the first day, Alexander," Julia reminded him. "We haven't solved all of Nicholas's problems. He'll still have difficult moments. He'll still miss his mom. But I think I can help him understand what he feels and how to cope with it." Alexander nodded. "Please call me Alexander, and please stay for dinner." "It's the least I can do." Julia smiled. "Thank you, Alexander. I'd love to stay." And so began a new era in the Sterling household, an era in which a little boy began to smile again, and his father began to see light amidst the darkness that had surrounded him since his wife's death. A month had passed since Julia Matthews first stepped into the Sterling apartment. October in New York City shimmered with gold and crimson, and morning fogs embraced the skyscrapers of the business district. In those 30 days, more changes had occurred in the home in the Sterling Tower than in the past 2 years. Nicholas still had difficult nights, but they had become the exception rather than the rule. Julia had developed a special evening ritual. First, a bubble bath with colorful toys, then a mug of warm milk with honey, followed by reading a book, always one chapter longer than she promised, which Nicholas considered his small victory, and finally, a moment to talk about his mom. This last element was Julia's idea, which initially worried Alexander. "Shouldn't we avoid the topic so as not to upset him?" he asked one evening after Nicholas was asleep. Julia shook her head, sitting with him in the living room with a glass of wine. Outside the window, the panorama of nighttime New York stretched, city lights twinkling like stars. "That's the worst thing we could do," she replied, turning the glass in her hand. "Children need to talk about their losses, to process them, to ask questions. If we pretend the topic doesn't exist, Nicholas will think his feelings are bad, something he should be ashamed of." Alexander pondered this. "You know, Anne was similar. She always said we should face problems, not pretend they don't exist." The memory of his wife still brought pain, But to his surprise, Alexander found that talking about her with Julia also brought a certain relief, as if sharing memories made Anne still a part of his life. That morning, Alexander watched from the kitchen as Julia helped Nicholas get ready for preschool. The boy went there 3 times a week. Julia believed that contact with peers was important for his emotional development. "And remember what we need to take today?" Julia asked, zipping up Nicholas's jacket. "My space atlas," the boy answered excitedly. "Today is Planet Day, and the teacher said we can bring books." "Exactly." Julia handed him a colorful book. "And what do you say to Dad?" Nicholas ran to Alexander and hugged him around the waist. "Bye, Dad. I'll tell you about the planets tonight." Alexander crouched down and hugged his son. "Can't wait. Have fun, astronaut." After Nicholas and Julia left, Alexander poured himself a second coffee and sat at the table, browsing the news on his tablet. He had an important meeting today with potential investors from Germany, but his thoughts kept returning to Julia. This young woman had transformed their lives in a month. Nicholas was a child again. He laughed, played, asked thousands of questions. He even started drawing colorful pictures, not just dark rockets flying to the sky. Alexander caught himself realizing that he too had changed under her influence. He started coming home earlier from work. He reduced business trips. He spent more time with his son. And the evening conversations with Julia over wine or tea had become something he looked forward to all day. Julia had something special about her, wisdom far beyond her 26 years, empathy that allowed her to understand people without words, and a strength that lay beneath her delicate appearance. She was different from all the women he had known. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He checked his watch. It was only 8:30, too early for a delivery or any visit. He walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing behind the door was Caroline, his mother-in-law, Anne's mother. A woman in her 60s, always elegant, with platinum blonde hair and perfect makeup. Their relationship since Anne's death had been, to put it mildly, strained. "Caroline," he greeted her, opening the door. "What a surprise." Alexander," she replied coolly, entering without an invitation. "We need to talk." Alexander sighed inwardly, but gestured for her to the living room. "Coffee? Tea?" "No, thank you," she replied, sitting stiffly on the sofa. "Where is Nicholas?" "At preschool. Julia will bring him home." At the sound of that name, Caroline raised an eyebrow. "That's what I wanted to talk about. About this Julia." Alexander felt his muscles tense. "I'm listening." "My friend Christine saw you with her and Nicholas in Central Park last week. She said you looked like a family," Caroline said with clear disapproval. "Is this girl something more than just my grandson's nanny?" "Julia is Nicholas's nanny," Alexander replied, trying to remain calm. "And she's doing an excellent job. Nicholas is finally sleeping through the night, laughing again, thriving." "She's too young," Caroline stated. "How old is she?" 24, 26, and I don't see what her age has to do with anything." Caroline leaned forward. "Alexander, I know you. I see how you look at her. That girl could be your daughter. Let's not exaggerate." Alexander felt his irritation grow. "She's 16 years younger, not 30. So you admit you're looking at her that way?" Caroline smiled triumphantly. "It's only been 2 years since Anne's death, and you're already looking for her replacement?" Those words hurt him more than he cared to admit. "Caroline, I appreciate your concern, but my personal life is my own business. And Julia is an excellent caregiver for Nicholas, and that's what matters most." "What if Nicholas starts to treat her like a mother?" Caroline asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if he forgets Anne?" Alexander sighed and sat next to his mother-in-law. "Nicholas will never forget Anne. Julia makes sure he remembers. They talk about her every day. They look at pictures. Thanks to Julia, memories of Anne have become something warm and loving for Nicholas, not a reason for tears." Caroline was silent for a moment, looking at a photo of her daughter on the dresser. "I still can't believe she's gone," she said softly, her voice losing its earlier sharpness. Sometimes I wake up in the morning, and for a split second I forget. And then I remember, and all the pain comes back. I know, Alexander replied, feeling his anger give way to compassion. I feel it too. I just worry you'll replace her, Caroline confessed. That you'll find a new wife, start a new family, and Anne will be forgotten. That will never happen, Alexander assured her. Anne will always be a part of me and Nicholas. But we can't live in the past. We have to move forward. For Nicholas. Caroline nodded, discreetly wiping a tear. I'd like to see Nicholas more often. I miss him. Of course, Alexander agreed. Maybe you could come for dinner on Sunday. Nicholas would be thrilled. After his mother-in-law left, Alexander was left alone with his thoughts. Caroline's words had stirred something in him, forcing him to confront feelings he had tried to ignore. Was he really looking at Julia that way? Was she more to him than just his son's nanny? His meeting with the German investors went well, but Alexander struggled to concentrate. He kept finding himself thinking about Julia, about her smile, about how she gestured when she spoke enthusiastically, about the scent of her perfume. Delicate, floral, but not overpowering. Late in the afternoon he returned home and found Julia and Nicholas in the living room. They were sitting on the floor surrounded by sheets of paper, markers and crayons. "What are you doing?" he asked, putting down his briefcase and loosening his tie. "Dad!" Nicholas called, running to him. "We're making a map of space. Julia's helping me draw all the planets." "And not just planets," Julia added, holding up one of the drawings. "There are also stars, black holes, comets, the whole universe." "Impressive." Alexander knelt to get a closer look at their work. "And what's this?" Well, he pointed to a gold star glued to one of the drawings. "That's Mommy," Nicholas replied seriously. "Julia says Mommy is a star now and watches us from the sky. So I drew her as the brightest star." Alexander looked at Julia with gratitude, unable to utter a word. She returned his gaze, and in her green eyes there was understanding and something else he couldn't name. After dinner, when Nicholas had gone to bed, again without protest, which still seemed a small miracle to Alexander, Julia began to gather her things to leave. "Stay a little longer," Alexander said, surprising himself. "I mean, I could open a bottle of wine. We haven't really talked in a while." Julia hesitated, but after a moment she nodded. "I'd like that. I just need to call my roommate so she doesn't wait up for dinner." They sat on the sofa in the living room, with glasses of red wine, observing the New York City night through the window. Conversation flowed naturally. They talked about Nicholas, about his progress, about how he had started asking about details of his mother's life. "It's a good sign," Julia said. "He wants to know her better, to keep her memory alive." "Thanks to you," Alexander replied. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my son." Julia smiled. "It's my job, Alexander. You don't have to thank me. It's more than a job. You've changed our lives," he said, looking her straight in the eyes. "I want to know more about you, about your life before us." Julia put down her glass and leaned back comfortably. "Well, there's not much to tell. I was born in Chicago, into a family of teachers. My dad taught history at the University of Chicago. My mom taught biology in high school. They were always absorbed in their work, so I spent a lot of time alone, reading books." "Is that why you became a psychologist?" Alexander asked. Julia shook her head with a gentle smile. "No, that came later. When I was 16, my best friend Maggie lost her father in an accident. I saw how she changed, how she faded. No one knew how to help her, how to talk to her. I didn't either. I felt helpless. That's when I decided I wanted to help people in grief, especially children." "And your parents? Do they still live in Chicago?" Julia's face clouded slightly. "My mom does. My dad passed away 5 years ago, lung cancer. He smoked his whole life." "I'm sorry," Alexander said, involuntarily touching her hand. "Thank you. It was tough, but it helped me better understand what my clients are going through," she replied, not withdrawing her hand. "And you, did you always want to be a businessman?" Alexander chuckled softly. "No, as a child I dreamed of being a pilot. But my father had other plans. He started a construction company in the 90s, right after the transition, and expected me to take it over. I studied economics at a top business school in Philadelphia, then an MBA in London. When I came back, my father's company was already quite large. I took it over 10 years ago and developed it into a capital group. And your parents? My father died shortly after I took over the company. A heart attack. My mother lives in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a house I built for her. Nicholas and I visit her every other Sunday. He paused for a moment. Anne, she really liked her. She often went to her alone without any special occasion, just for tea and a chat. The memory of Anne hung between them, creating a moment of awkward silence. What was she like? Julia asked softly. Anne? Alexander pondered, searching for words. Full of life, she had such brightness about her. She worked as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum. She loved art. She always managed to find beauty in things others would walk past without noticing. She was my opposite, spontaneous, creative, emotional. I guess that's why we fit together so well. How did you meet? At a charity gala 8 years ago. My company was one of the sponsors, and the museum where she worked was the organizer. We literally bumped into each other at the buffet. He smiled at the memory. She spilled red wine on me. I was furious. I had an important meeting later, and she just laughed and said she saved me from a terrible business meeting and that I should thank her. She was right. That contract turned out to be a complete bust. Julia laughed, and the sound of her laughter was like music in the quiet apartment. She sounds like an exceptional woman. She was, Alexander confirmed, and I still can't believe she left so early. We had so many plans, so many dreams. Julia gently squeezed his hand. You can still have dreams, Alexander. Anne would have wanted that. Their gazes met, and for a moment Alexander felt as if time had stopped. There was something in Julia's green eyes that made him feel both vulnerable and safe, as if she could look straight into his soul and see all his fears, all his hopes, all his unspoken desires. Julia's phone rang, interrupting the moment. She looked at the screen and sighed. My roommate. She's worried where I am at this hour, she said, standing up. I should go. Alexander stood up too, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Of course. I'll order you a cab. No need. I have an app, she replied, reaching for her purse. Thank you for the wine and the conversation. It was a nice evening. For me too, Alexander admitted, walking her to the door. Until tomorrow? Until tomorrow, she confirmed with a smile. When he closed the door behind her, Alexander leaned against it and closed his eyes. He felt like a teenager after a first date, with his heart beating too fast and his thoughts swirling in his head. Something was changing within him, something he hadn't planned and wasn't prepared for. Julia Matthews was no longer just his son's nanny. She had become someone far more significant. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Alexander Sterling fell asleep with a smile on his lips, thinking not of the past, but of the future. November brought the first frost and short grey days to New York City. In Central Park, where just weeks ago the trees shimmered with red and gold, they now stood bare, their branches stark against the pale sky. Nicholas, bundled in a navy blue puffer jacket and a red scarf, ran among them, collecting the last chestnuts he found beneath the rustling leaves. Julia walked a few steps behind him, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets. Her cheeks were reddened by the cold, and puffs of vapor escaped her lips. She watched the boy with a tender smile, ready to react if he slipped on the slick leaves. "Julia, look how many I found," Nicholas called, running to her with pockets full of chestnuts. "Enough for a whole chestnut family." "Wonderful," she replied, crouching beside him. "We can make Christmas decorations out of them. Christmas is coming soon." At the mention of the holidays, Nicholas's face saddened. Last year was sad. Dad hardly left his room. Julia gently stroked his cheek. "This year will be different, I promise. We'll decorate a beautiful tree. You and Dad will bake gingerbread cookies, just like we planned. And will you be with us for the holidays too?" Nicholas asked, looking at her with wide brown eyes so much like his father's. The question surprised Julia. I don't know, Nicholas. The holidays are for family. But you're like family, the boy stated with childlike simplicity. Right? Julia felt a tightening in her throat. In the past 2 months, she had grown to love this little boy with all her heart. Every day when she walked into the Sterling apartment, it felt like she was coming home, and yet she knew she was balancing on a thin line. She was a caregiver, an employee, not a family member. She shouldn't allow herself such feelings, shouldn't get too attached, but how could she stop herself? I love you very much, Nicholas, she finally said, hugging him, and I always will, no matter what. Now how about some hot chocolate? It's getting chilly. At a cafe on the edge of the park, they ordered 2 hot chocolates, one with whipped cream for Nicholas and one with cinnamon for Julia. They sat by the window watching passers-by outside, wrapped in scarves and coats, hurrying through the November twilight. Julia? Nicholas looked up from his hot chocolate, leaving a white whipped cream mustache above his upper lip. Do you like my dad? Julia choked on her drink. What? Why do you ask? Because Dad smiles when he looks at you, just like he smiled at Mommy in the pictures, Nicholas replied, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. Julia felt her cheeks flush, and this time it wasn't from the cold. Your dad and I are friends, Nicholas. But you could be more, the boy stated with innocent certainty. My friend from preschool, Jake, has a new mum. His real mum died, like mine, and then his dad met a new lady, and now she's his new mum. Julia put down her mug, wondering how to answer such a statement. That's complicated, Nicholas. Adults sometimes, it's not that simple. Why? The boy asked, tilting his head. If you like each other, what's stopping you? Many things, Julia thought. 16 years age difference. The fact that I'm employed as your caregiver. The shadow of your mother that still hangs over us. The fear that what I feel is one-sided. We'll talk about this another time, okay? She replied, trying to buy time. Finish your hot chocolate. We need to get back before dark. When they returned to the apartment, Alexander wasn't home yet. Julia helped Nicholas with his math homework, then prepared dinner, a simple chicken and vegetable casserole. She was just taking it out of the oven when she heard the sound of the door opening. It must be Dad, Nicholas called out, jumping up from the table where he had been arranging chestnuts by size. Alexander entered the kitchen, carrying a briefcase and a bouquet of red roses. He was dressed in a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and tall stature. Despite the fatigue visible on his face, he smiled broadly at the sight of his son. "Hey, little man," he said, picking Nicholas up with one arm and hugging him. "How was your day?" "Great. Julia and I were at the park and collected chestnuts, and then we drank hot chocolate, and I told her about the planets and—" "Breathe between words, son," Alexander laughed, setting him back on the floor. Then he looked at Julia, and his smile became somehow deeper, more personal. "Hi." "Hi," she replied, feeling her heart race. She tried to ignore the feeling, but it was getting harder every day. "Dinner's almost ready." "Wonderful, I'm starving," Alexander said. And then, as if remembering something, he held out the bouquet of roses. "These are for you, as a thank you for everything you do for us." Julia took the flowers, feeling her cheeks flush again. "Thank you, but you really didn't have to—" "I had to," Alexander interrupted her, and their gazes met for a moment that seemed to last longer than it should have. "And what did you bring for me, Dad?" Nicholas asked, breaking the moment. Alexander laughed and pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. "And did you think I'd forget about you, astronaut?" Nicholas joyfully opened the box, which contained a small silver keychain in the shape of a rocket. "Awesome. Thank you, Dad." "You're welcome. Now maybe you can help Julia set the table while I change," Alexander suggested. During dinner, they talked about their day. Nicholas told stories about preschool and chestnuts, Julia about their walk, and Alexander about business meetings. There was something so natural, so domestic about it, that Julia had to remind herself that this wasn't her family, that she was only here as an employee. When Nicholas went to bed, Alexander, as usual, offered her a glass of wine. They sat in the living room on the same sofa that had become the place for their evening conversations. "Something's bothering you," Alexander observed, watching her carefully. "You seem distracted today." Julia sighed, turning the glass in her hand. "Nicholas asked me a difficult question today." "Oh?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What was it?" "He asked if I liked you," Julia replied, deciding to be honest. "And he said you smile at me the same way you smiled at Anne in the pictures." Alexander froze, and an expression she couldn't interpret appeared in his eyes. "And what did you tell him?" "That we're friends," Julia said, avoiding his gaze. "But he mentioned a friend from preschool whose dad remarried after his wife died. He asked why it's not that simple." Alexander put his glass down on the table and moved closer to her on the sofa. "And why isn't it that simple, Julia?" She looked up and saw him staring intently, with expectation and something else. Hope? Apprehension? She couldn't read it. Because I'm your son's nanny," she began uncertainly. "Because there's a 16-year age difference between us. Because you still love Anne. Because maybe what I feel is only in my head." "And what do you feel?" he asked softly, so softly she barely heard him. Julia felt her heart pounding like a drum. She was on the edge, ready to leap into an abyss without knowing if anyone would catch her. "I feel that I'm falling in love with you," she finally confessed, and the words hung between them like something tangible. "And I'm afraid of this feeling because I know I shouldn't, that it complicates everything, that—" She didn't finish because Alexander suddenly leaned in and kissed her. His lips were warm, gentle, questioning. Julia froze for a moment, surprised, and then returned the kiss, allowing all the suppressed emotions to surface. When they pulled apart, both were breathing rapidly, as if they had run a long distance. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, holding her face in his hands. "I'm falling in love with you too," he said softly. "And I'm afraid of it too. But life is too short to be afraid of feelings, Julia. Anne taught me that in the cruelest way." Julia closed her eyes, still unable to believe it was happening. "What about Nicholas? What about him?" "He adores you," Alexander replied. "I think he saw what we didn't want to see." "And what about the age difference? The fact that I work for you?" Alexander moved back slightly to look into her eyes. "Julia, you are the most mature and wise person I know, regardless of age. And as for work, well, we can change that. We can find another caregiver for Nicholas if you think that would be better." Julia shook her head. "I don't want to leave Nicholas. I love him." "I know," Alexander smiled. "And he loves you. We both do." He kissed her again, this time more confidently, deeper. Julia felt a wave of happiness wash over her, so intense it was almost painful. But somewhere deep in her consciousness, apprehension lingered. Could this work? Was it too complicated? Too risky? "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked when they pulled apart again. "About how much I'm afraid of ruining this," she admitted honestly. "That I'll hurt you, or worse, Nicholas." "We can't predict the future," Alexander said, stroking her cheek. "We can only decide if it's worth taking the risk. For me, it is. And for you." Julia looked him straight in the eyes. "For me, too." That night, Julia returned to her small apartment in Brooklyn, which she shared with her university friend Maya. But she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, touching her lips with her fingers, still remembering the taste of Alexander's kisses. Had it really happened? Had she really confessed her feelings? Had he really returned them? Her phone on her nightstand vibrated. A message from Alexander. "Can't sleep. Thinking about you. About what happened tonight. I don't regret a single second. Do you?" Julia smiled at her phone and replied, "Can't sleep either, and I don't regret it either, though I'm still scared." The reply came almost immediately. "I'm scared too, but I'm more scared of living without you. Good night, Julia. Until tomorrow." The next day, when Julia arrived for work, she felt both excited and nervous. How should they behave now? Would Nicholas notice a change? Should they tell him that something was beginning between them? Alexander had to leave early for a meeting, so she didn't find him at home. Nicholas was excited about an upcoming performance at preschool. He was playing an astronaut in a play about a trip to the moon. "You have to help me learn my lines, Julia," he said, pulling her by the hand to his room, where a paper with his script lay. The whole day passed with normal activities: preschool, lunch, homework, play. But Julia couldn't stop thinking about Alexander, about their kiss, about the confession they had shared. Could it be real? Could a man like him, rich, handsome, experienced, really fall in love with someone like her? In the evening, after Nicholas was asleep and she was getting ready to leave, she heard the sound of the door opening. Alexander entered the apartment looking tired, but when he saw her, his face lit up with a smile. "Hi," he said softly, walking towards her. "Hi," she replied, suddenly shy, as if she were a teenager again. They stood facing each other, unsure how to act. And then Alexander took a step forward and embraced her, holding her tightly. "I thought about you all day," he admitted, whispering in her ear. "I wondered if it was a dream." "Me too," she replied, burying her face in his shirt. He smelled so familiar: cologne, coffee, and something that was uniquely his scent. But it wasn't a dream. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "No, it wasn't a dream," he said, and then leaned in and kissed her, as if to make sure it was all real. When they finished, Julia rested her head on his shoulder. "What now?" she asked softly. "Now, we take it one step at a time," Alexander replied. "Let's not rush. Let's give ourselves time. And let's give Nicholas time to get used to the idea that his dad and his beloved caregiver are together." "So we're together?" Julia asked, needing confirmation. Alexander smiled, kissing her forehead. "If you want that, then yes, we're together." "I do," she replied without hesitation, "but we have to be careful. For Nicholas's sake." "Of course," Alexander agreed. "Everything we do with him in mind." Julia nodded, feeling the immense responsibility on their shoulders. They were embarking on an unknown path, full of potential pitfalls and difficulties. But she also felt that it was right, that it was their chance for happiness. "Will you stay the night?" Alexander asked suddenly, a hesitant glint in his eyes. Julia hesitated. "No, I don't think that's a good idea, not yet. Nicholas might be surprised to see me in your bedroom in the morning." Alexander nodded, accepting her decision. "You're right. Let's not rush. We have time." He ordered her a cab and walked her to the door. As a farewell, he kissed her for a long time, as if he didn't want to let her go. "Until tomorrow," he said when they finally pulled apart. "Until tomorrow," she replied with a smile. In the taxi returning to Brooklyn, Julia looked at the passing streets of New York and couldn't believe her happiness. But she also couldn't shake off the delicate unease that lurked in the back of her mind. She was entering a relationship that was complicated on many levels. Alexander was her employer, much older than her, a widower with a young child. And she was just a girl from Chicago trying to find her place in the world. Could this work? Did she have the right to such happiness? A week later, Julia and Alexander sat with Nicholas in the living room, building a massive space station out of Lego bricks. Outside, the first snow was falling, covering New York in a white blanket that reflected the city lights, brightening the November twilight. "Dad, we need more of these white bricks here," Nicholas said, pointing to a part of the construction. "This will be the research lab." "Looking for them now," Alexander replied, sifting through the box of bricks. His hand brushed against Julia's, who was doing the same, and he paused for a moment to intertwine their fingers. They exchanged glances full of tenderness. Over the past week, they had slowly discovered their relationship, spending evenings in conversation, sharing kisses when Nicholas was asleep, getting to know each other anew, not as employer and employee, but as a man and a woman falling in love. Nicholas watched them with a thoughtful look. "Are you two like a mommy and daddy now?" he suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Julia and Alexander looked at each other, surprised by the directness of the question. It was the moment they had feared, but also one they had been waiting for. "Nicholas," Alexander began, searching for the right words. "Julia and I really like each other, more than friends, but that doesn't mean Julia is replacing your mommy. No one will ever replace your mommy." "I know," the boy replied, placing another brick. "Mommy's a star in the sky, but Julia's here on Earth, and she makes you smile, and me too." Julia felt tears welling in her eyes. "Nicholas, I love you very much," she said, hugging the boy. "And I always will, no matter what." "I know," Nicholas repeated, hugging her back. "I love you too, and I'm happy you're with us." Alexander embraced both of them, forming a small, warm circle in the middle of the living room. In that moment, surrounded by the love of the two most important people to her, Julia felt she had finally found her place in the world. Here, in the apartment on the 30th floor of the New York skyscraper, with a billionaire and his son who had become her family. And somewhere high above them, among the stars, Anne Sterling looked down at them with a smile, blessing their new life together. But fate still had a few surprises in store for them. Not all of them would be pleasant. Christmas was fast approaching. New York had put on its holiday attire. Streets glowed with colorful illuminations, shop windows displayed festive decorations, and the scent of mulled wine and gingerbread from the holiday market hung in the air. A massive Christmas tree stood downtown, its ceremonial lighting attracting crowds of New Yorkers, including Julia, Alexander, and Nicholas. Over the past month, their relationship had blossomed, gradually moving from tentative kisses to a deep, mature affection. Julia still hadn't moved into Alexander's apartment, but she spent almost every night there, slipping out at dawn so Nicholas wouldn't find her in his father's bedroom in the morning. Although the boy knew about their relationship and seemed to accept it, they agreed that some changes should happen slowly. This December evening was exceptionally cold. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and breath froze in the air, creating small white clouds. Despite the chill, the plaza in front of the Metropolitan Tower was filled with people who had come to admire the Christmas lights. "Look, Dad! Look, Julia!" Nicholas shouted excitedly, pointing to the enormous Christmas tree that suddenly lit up with thousands of lights, eliciting gasps of delight from the crowd. "It's huge!" "Indeed impressive," Alexander agreed, putting an arm around Julia, who snuggled into him, seeking warmth. "But ours will be prettier, won't it?" "Of course," Julia replied with a smile, "because we'll decorate it ourselves, our way." Nicholas, who was holding her hand, tugged gently. "Julia, when are we going to buy the Christmas tree? You promised this week." "And I'll keep my promise," she assured him, adjusting his hat, which had slipped over his eyes. "How about tomorrow after preschool?" "Yes!" the boy shouted enthusiastically. "We'll buy the biggest one." Alexander laughed. "Maybe not the biggest, but certainly the prettiest. Now how about some hot chocolate? I'm starting to freeze." They found a cozy cafe near the plaza, where they ordered hot drinks and cheesecake, which Nicholas devoured in record time. While the boy went to the restroom with Alexander, Julia took out her phone to check messages. Among the notifications, she found a text from Caroline, Alexander's mother-in-law. "Could we meet tomorrow? Just us. Important matter. Please don't tell Alexander." Julia frowned, wondering what it could be about. Her relationship with Caroline was polite but distant. Anne's mother was civil to her because of Nicholas, but Julia knew the woman had mixed feelings about her relationship with Alexander. She sighed and replied, "Of course. Where and when?" A reply came almost immediately. "The Rosewood Cafe in Greenwich Village, 11 o'clock. Thank you." Julia managed to put her phone away before Alexander and Nicholas returned to the table. "What are you thinking so intensely about?" Alexander asked, taking a seat beside her. "About the holidays," she lied, smiling. "About what to cook for Christmas Eve dinner." "Will we have turkey?" Nicholas asked. "Grandma Caroline always made turkey." "If you want turkey, then we'll have turkey," Julia assured him. And maybe we could invite Grandma Caroline and Mrs. Eleanor for Christmas Eve dinner. So they're not alone." Alexander looked at her gratefully. "That's a wonderful idea. I'll call them tomorrow." Later, after Nicholas was asleep and they lay nestled together in Alexander's bed, Julia wondered if she should tell him about Caroline's message, but she ultimately decided it was better to first see what it was about. Maybe it was nothing important. Perhaps Caroline just wanted to get to know her better, understand her, or ask for help choosing a gift for Nicholas. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, stroking her hair. "About the future," she replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. "About us. About Nicholas." Alexander propped himself up on an elbow to look into her eyes. "I'm thinking about that too. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Julia felt her heart race. "Yes?" "Nicholas asks when you're moving in with us," Alexander said. "And frankly, I'm wondering about it too. I know it's fast, but I feel it's right. I want to fall asleep and wake up beside you every day. I want you to be a part of our daily lives, not just a guest." Julia felt tears welling in her eyes. For the past month, she had wondered if what was developing between them was real and lasting, or if it was just a fleeting infatuation that would pass as quickly as it appeared. But seeing the sincerity and deep affection in Alexander's eyes, she knew it was more than that. "I want that too," she replied softly, "but isn't it too fast for Nicholas? And what about your mother-in-law, your mum? What will people say?" Alexander sighed, hugging her tighter. "People will always talk. They'll always find a reason to gossip. We can't live by their expectations. And as for Nicholas, he already treats you like a family member. He was the first one to ask why you weren't living with us permanently." Julia smiled through her tears. "He's amazing. So mature for his age." "He gets it from his mom," Alexander said with a hint of melancholy in his voice. "Anne always saw more than others. And you know what? I think she would accept this. That she would be happy, knowing I found someone who loves her son as much as you do." Julia embraced him, burying her face in his neck. "I love you both. And yes, I'll move in. Maybe after the holidays. So Nicholas has time to get used to the idea that I'll be staying here permanently." Alexander kissed her, first gently, then with increasing intensity. "I love you, Julia Matthews," he whispered when they finally pulled apart. "And I love you, Alexander Sterling," she replied, surrendering to the wave of happiness that enveloped her entirely. The next day, Julia sat in the Rosewood Cafe, nervously twirling her coffee cup in her hands. Promptly at 11 o'clock, the cafe door opened, and Caroline entered. She looked elegant as always, wearing a grey cashmere coat, her platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect bob. Despite having turned 65 last month, she was still an attractive woman, her age betrayed only by the lines around her eyes and mouth. "Thank you for coming," she said, taking a seat opposite Julia. "I appreciate it." "What is this about, Mrs. Sterling?" Julia asked, deciding to get straight to the point. Caroline put down her purse and looked at her carefully. "Julia, I won't mince words. I know your relationship with Alexander has developed beyond professional boundaries. I know you're together." Julia felt her cheeks flush. "Yes, that's true. We love each other." "Love," Caroline pronounced the word with strange emphasis. "Do you know how many times that word has appeared in Alexander's life? Once, when he met my daughter. And now, 2 years after her death, he's suddenly in love again. Don't you find that suspicious?" Julia took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling, love doesn't operate on a schedule. You can't plan it or predict it." "Perhaps," Caroline agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. "But one can be sensible. Consider this, Julia. What do you two have in common? You're 26 years old. He's 42. He's one of the wealthiest men in the country. You are, what? A children's caregiver. He has a marriage behind him, the loss of a wife, experiences you know nothing about. He heads a business empire. You're just starting your career." Each word was like a pin pricking Julia's heart. Not because they were cruel, but because they echoed her own doubts, which she had tried to ignore. "We love each other," she repeated, though her voice sounded less certain. "And that's what matters most." Caroline sighed, as if talking to a naive child. "Love isn't always enough, Julia. Life isn't a fairy tale. And even if he truly loves you, think about what your life together will be like. You'll be a billionaire's wife, invited to banquets and galas, where you'll sit beside people who run huge companies, who shape the American economy. What will you say to them? What will you talk about with them? How quickly will Alexander start to feel embarrassed by your shortcomings?" "I'm not stupid," Julia replied, feeling anger rising within her. "Maybe I don't run a big company, but I have an education, I have values, I have something to say." "I'm not suggesting you're stupid," Caroline said more gently. "On the contrary, I see you're intelligent and sensitive. And that's precisely why I think you should truly reflect on what you're doing, not just for your own sake, but also for Nicholas's." And that name fell between them like a heavy stone. Julia felt her anger give way to apprehension. "What do you mean?" Caroline looked her straight in the eyes. "Nicholas lost his mother. He went through hell. Only now is he beginning to recover, thanks to you, it's true. But what happens if you and Alexander break up, if it turns out your differences are too great? Nicholas will lose another person he's come to love, another mother figure. How do you think that will affect him?" Julia felt the blood drain from her face. She had never looked at it from that perspective. She had been so focused on her own happiness, on what she felt for Alexander and Nicholas, that she hadn't considered what would happen if their relationship didn't last. "I love Nicholas," she said softly. "I would never want to hurt him." "I know," Caroline replied, a touch of compassion in her voice. "I see that, and that's why you needed to hear this. I'm not asking you to make a decision right away. I'm just asking you to think carefully. Are you truly ready for a life by Alexander's side? For all the complications that come with it? For the responsibility for Nicholas's emotional well-being?" Julia remained silent, not knowing what to say. Part of her wanted to protest, to tell Caroline she was wrong, that their love would overcome all obstacles. But another part, the more rational one, wondered if the woman wasn't right. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "I promise." Caroline nodded, satisfied. "That's all I ask. And one more thing, Julia. Please don't tell Alexander about this conversation. I know how he would react. He would think I'm meddling, that I'm trying to control his life, and I just want to protect my grandson. And yes, you too." Julia looked at her in astonishment. "Me?" "Yes, you," Caroline confirmed. "You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. I don't want you to make a decision you'll regret." After her meeting with Caroline, Julia walked as if in a trance. Instead of returning to Alexander's apartment, she went to her own apartment in Brooklyn, needing time to think everything over. Maya, her roommate, was at work, so she had the place to herself. She sat on her bed, hugging her knees, and let Caroline's words swirl in her head. Was she really ready for a life with Alexander, to be part of his world, to be a stepmother to Nicholas? What if it didn't work out? What if the differences between them really proved too great? Her phone rang. "Alexander." "Hey," he said when she answered. "Where are you? Nicholas can't wait to go get the Christmas tree." "I'm sorry," she replied, trying to make her voice sound normal. "I had to take care of something. I'll be there in an hour." "Is everything okay?" he asked, sensing the tension in her voice. "Yes, just a small headache. Nothing serious." "Are you sure? You sound strange." "Definitely," she assured him. "See you soon." She hung up and sighed deeply. How could she hide her doubts from him? How could she pretend everything was fine when her mind was full of unanswered questions? An hour later, she was with Alexander and Nicholas at a bustling Christmas tree lot on the Upper West Side. Nicholas ran between the fir trees, assessing each one with the professional air of a small expert. "This one's the best," he finally shouted, pointing to a majestic fir tree that had to be at least 8 feet tall. "It's huge! And it'll barely fit in the elevator." Alexander observed with a smile. "But if that's the one you want, we'll take it." As the salesman packaged the tree, Alexander put an arm around Julia. "Are you sure everything's okay? You seem a little distant today." "Yes, just a lot on my mind," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "About us, about the future." "And what conclusions have you come to?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. "That I love you," she said, because that was the one thing she was sure of, and that sometimes love is complicated. Alexander looked at her with concern. "Julia, if you have any doubts, we can slow down. We don't have to rush your move-in. We can give ourselves more time." Julia shook her head. "It's not that, I'm wondering if I'm really the one you need, the one Nicholas needs." "You are," Alexander said with such certainty that for a moment her doubts vanished. "You are exactly what we both need. Never doubt that." Nicholas ran up to them, interrupting their conversation. "Dad, the salesman is asking if we want a tree stand too." "Of course," Alexander replied, letting go of Julia to finalize the purchase. Julia watched as father and son talked to the salesman, how Nicholas bounced with excitement, how Alexander placed a hand on his head in a loving gesture. She loved them both so much it hurt. Could she leave them? Could she abandon them just because she was afraid of the future? But could she also ignore Carolyn's warnings, ignore her own doubts? That evening, as they decorated the Christmas tree, Julia tried to be joyful and present for Nicholas. The boy was in seventh heaven, hanging ornaments and lights on the branches of the fir tree, which filled the living room with the scent of the forest. Alexander played Christmas songs, and Mrs. Eleanor prepared hot chocolate and cookies. It was a perfect family evening, exactly the kind Julia had always dreamed of. And yet, she couldn't shake the shadow that had fallen over her happiness. When Nicholas went to bed, and she and Alexander were left alone in the living room, lit only by the Christmas tree lights, she knew she had to talk to him. She couldn't pretend any longer that everything was fine. "Alexander," she began, sitting beside him on the sofa, "we need to talk." He looked at her with apprehension. "That's never a good start to a conversation." "I'm sorry," she sighed. "I don't know how else to put it. Today I met with Caroline." "My mother-in-law?" he asked, surprised. "Why?" "She asked me to meet," Julia explained. "She wanted to talk about us, about our relationship." Alexander frowned. "And you didn't tell me?" "She asked me not to, and I wanted to hear what she had to say first." "And what did she have to say?" he asked, a chill in his voice she hadn't heard before. Julia took a deep breath. "She asked if I was sure I knew what I was doing. If I realized the differences between us, age, status, experience, if I was ready for a life by your side, for all the complications that come with it." "And what did you tell her?" "That I love you," Julia said, looking him straight in the eyes. "But, Alexander, some of her questions, they're also my questions, my doubts." Alexander moved away slightly, as if she had slapped him. "You have doubts about us?" "Not about my feelings," she clarified quickly. "I love you and I love Nicholas, but I'm afraid I'm not enough, that I'm not the one you two need." "Did Caroline put these absurd ideas in your head?" he asked angrily. "I should have known she'd try to ruin our happiness. She always had an obsession with Anne, with what she would do, what she would say." "It's not just about her," Julia said. "It's also about Nicholas. What if it doesn't work out for us? What if we break up? He'll lose another person he loves. How will that affect him?" Alexander was silent for a moment, his anger seeming to give way to sadness. "So what do you propose? That we break up now for Nicholas's sake? That we don't even try to be happy because there's a risk it might not work out?" "No," Julia denied. "I don't know what I'm proposing. I need time. I need to think this all through." "I understand," Alexander said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "So you want to leave?" "No," she repeated, feeling tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want to leave, but maybe we should slow down. Maybe I shouldn't move in yet. Maybe we should give ourselves more time to make sure this is what we both want." Alexander stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to her. Outside, New York glittered with holiday lights, and snowflakes danced in the air like white butterflies. "I thought you were different," he said softly. "I thought you understood that there are no certainties in life, that there's always a risk, but it's a risk worth taking if you love." "Alexander," she began, but he interrupted her with a gesture. "No," he said, turning back to her. In his eyes was a pain that broke her heart. "I understand. Truly. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Why would you tie yourself down to a widower with a child? To a man who has his scars, his baggage? Why would you condemn yourself to being a stepmother, to living in the shadow of another woman?" "It's not like that," Julia protested, standing up and walking to him. "I love you. I love Nicholas. It's not about your baggage, your scars. It's about me, my fears, my doubts." Alexander looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not only pain but also understanding. "I know," he said more gently, "and that's why I think you're right. We should slow down, give ourselves more time. I don't want you to make a decision you'll regret." Julia embraced him, burying her face in his chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I'm not stronger." "You have nothing to apologize for," he replied, stroking her hair. "Everyone has a right to doubts, to fear. It's normal." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other as if it were their last time. And Julia couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was, that maybe she had just ruined the most beautiful thing that had ever happened in her life. Christmas Eve. The first snow that had fallen in December had already melted, leaving behind grey, wet streets in New York. But that evening, the sky opened again, scattering fine, white flakes that slowly covered the city with a fresh blanket, as if to erase all the sorrows and regrets of the past year. In the apartment on the 30th floor of the Sterling Tower, a festive atmosphere reigned. The Christmas tree glittered with colorful lights. The table was set with a white tablecloth, beneath which, according to tradition, lay hay. 12 Christmas Eve dishes, prepared jointly by Julia, Mrs. Eleanor, and Caroline, awaited the guests. Besides the three of them, there was Alexander's mother, Elizabeth Sterling, and his brother with his wife and children. Despite the festive atmosphere, Julia couldn't shake the feeling of melancholy that had accompanied her since her conversation with Alexander a week ago. As he had suggested, they had slowed the pace of their relationship. Julia had returned to her apartment in Brooklyn, though she still cared for Nicholas. The boy didn't understand the change, and often asked why Julia no longer stayed the night, but he accepted the adult's explanations that sometimes people need space. Alexander was polite but distant. Julia missed his smile, their evening conversations, the closeness they shared. But she knew she had asked for space, for time to think everything over. She couldn't blame him for giving her exactly what she had asked for. "Julia, could you pass the soup?" Caroline's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Everyone is already seated at the table." Julia took the tureen of borscht and carried it to the dining room, where the Sterling family had already taken their places. Nicholas sat between his father and his grandmother, Elizabeth, enthusiastically telling stories about a gift he had received recently. "Julia, there's a place for you here," Mrs. Elizabeth said, indicating an empty chair beside her. "Sit, dear." Elizabeth Sterling was a 65-year-old elegant woman with silver hair and a warm smile. Unlike Caroline, she had welcomed Julia with open arms from the start, seeing how happy she made her son and grandson. Christmas Eve dinner proceeded in a pleasant atmosphere, despite the initial stiffness. Everyone tried to be polite, to share a piece of blessed wafer, or in this adapted setting to simply share warm holiday wishes, to exchange greetings. But Julia felt Alexander's gaze on her from across the table. In his eyes, she saw the unspoken question, "Have you decided yet? Do you know what you want?" After dinner, as the children opened presents under the Christmas tree and the adults chatted over a glass of wine, Julia stepped out onto the balcony, needing a moment of solitude. Despite her thick sweater, she shivered from the cold. New York stretched beneath her, glittering with thousands of lights, and snowflakes danced in the air like white butterflies. "You'll freeze," she heard Alexander's voice behind her. She turned and saw him standing in the balcony doorway with her coat in his hand. "I brought this for you." "Thank you," she replied, allowing him to help her put on the coat. His touch, even through the thick fabric, sent a wave of longing through her. They stood side by side, looking at the city skyline, not saying a word. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "I'm glad you agreed to spend Christmas Eve with us. Nicholas really wanted you here." "I wanted to be here too," Julia replied. "With you all. With you." Alexander looked at her, and in his eyes was sadness mixed with hope. "Does that mean—" Julia took a deep breath. Over the past week, she had analyzed every thought, every doubt. She had talked to Maya, her roommate, who listened to her dilemmas, and then simply asked, "Can you imagine life without them?" And Julia understood that no, she couldn't imagine life without Alexander and Nicholas. That despite all her fears, despite all the differences, she wanted to be with them. "I love you," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. "And I'm sorry I let other people's words and my own fears shake what we have. I want to be with you all, if you still want that." Alexander embraced her, holding her tightly. "Of course I do. I never stopped." As they kissed, Julia felt the snow settling on her hair and eyelashes, the cold wind embracing them both, but in her heart it was warm. Finally, she was certain. This was her home, her family, her place in the world. Inside the apartment, Nicholas noticed them through the glass and smiled broadly. He was already running to show Julia the present he had found under the tree, a book about space, exactly what he had dreamed of. But he paused for a moment, seeing the adults talking. Something in their posture, in the way they stood close to each other, told him that everything would be all right, that his family would be whole again. And somewhere high above them, among the stars, Anne Sterling looked down at them with a smile, blessing their love, wishing them happiness in the new year and in everyone to come, which they were meant to spend together. Spring in New York City was exceptionally beautiful that year. Central Park exploded with greenery, flowers bloomed everywhere, and birds sang from dawn to dusk. 5 months had passed since that memorable Christmas Eve, when Julia and Alexander found each other anew. Just after New Year's Day, Julia moved into the Sterling apartment, officially becoming part of the family. Nicholas embraced the change with enthusiasm, helping her arrange things in the bedroom she now shared with his dad. Her small desk found its place by the window with a view of the city skyline, and books on child psychology filled a shelf in the living room. Caroline, to Julia's surprise, accepted their relationship with a certain resignation, and eventually even with a touch of warmth. "I see you truly love him," she once said, as they prepared dinner together, "and that Nicholas is happy with you." That's all Anne asked for before she died, that her son would be happy. Nicholas indeed flourished. He stopped having sleep problems, developed new interests beyond space, though it still remained his favorite topic, and made friends with several children from preschool. Julia continued her work with him, but no longer as a nanny, but as something more, someone who held a unique place in his heart, between the memory of his mom and the daily presence of his dad. That May afternoon, Julia sat on a bench in the park, watching Nicholas play with other children on the playground. The sun filtered through the leaves of the trees, creating shimmering patterns on the grass. She was so absorbed in the sight that she didn't notice when Alexander sat beside her. "Sorry, I'm late," he said, kissing her cheek. "The meeting ran long." "It's all right," she replied with a smile. "Nicholas is having a great time. He didn't even notice you were gone." Alexander put an arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder, enjoying the closeness. Over the past months, their relationship had matured, deepened, becoming something more beautiful and stronger than she could have imagined. "What are you thinking so intensely about?" he asked, stroking her hair. About us, she answered honestly. About how much my life has changed in the past year, how incredibly happy I am. Alexander smiled, but a strange glint appeared in his eyes. I'm happy too, more than I thought I ever would be again. Nicholas noticed them and waved enthusiastically. They waved back, smiling broadly. Julia, Alexander began in a more serious tone, there's something I want to talk to you about. She felt her heart race. I'm listening. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I planned to do this tonight, over dinner at your favorite restaurant. But sitting here, looking at you and Nicholas, I realized there's no better moment than now. He opened the box, where a ring with a delicate sapphire surrounded by small diamonds gleamed. Julia Matthews, will you make me the happiest man in the world and become my wife? Julia felt tears welling in her eyes. For a split second, all the doubts, all the fears she once had, flashed before her eyes. But now she knew she had nothing to fear, that this was her place, her home, her family. Yes, she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. Of course I will. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and then kissed her tenderly. At that very moment, Nicholas ran up to them, as if sensing that something important was happening. What happened? He asked, looking from his father to Julia. Julia has agreed to be my wife, Alexander explained, putting an arm around his son. That means we'll be a real family, that Julia will stay with us forever. Nicholas's eyes widened, and then he threw himself around Julia's neck, hugging her tightly. Hooray! I knew it! I knew it! Julia embraced him, feeling her heart fill with love. She had once been afraid she wasn't enough, that she wasn't the one they needed. Now she knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be. I love you, Nicholas, she said, kissing the top of his head. And you, Alexander. I love you both with all my heart. We love you too, Alexander replied, embracing them both. More than words can express. The three of them sat on the park bench, surrounded by the spring sun, the laughter of children, and the scent of blooming trees. Julia looked at the ring, sparkling on her finger, at Nicholas's smiling face, at Alexander's loving eyes, and knew she had found her home, that she had found her place in the world. Sometimes life brings unexpected gifts. Sometimes love comes when we least expect it. And sometimes, as in the case of Julia, Alexander, and Nicholas, that love is strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds, to illuminate even the darkest night. Because that's what life is ultimately about. Love that overcomes all obstacles. A home that we find in the arms of our loved ones. A family that we create, sometimes in the most unexpected circumstances.